Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey, not to the pyramids or the grand temples as a tourist, but behind the scenes, into the inner sanctums of ancient Egyptian religion. We're going to peel back the layers of reverence and mystery to reveal what it sucked to be a priest in ancient Egypt and more. You might imagine a life of quiet devotion and immense power, but trust me, the reality was often one of arduous discipline, unpleasant rituals, and surprising discomfort. A quick reality check. With your love of sleep and personal comfort probably wouldn't last a single week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling up to it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You might think that being a priest in ancient Egypt meant a life of serene contemplation, perhaps meditating in a quiet corner of a grand temple. But the reality was far more demanding, particularly due to the incredibly strict requirements for the grueling purity rituals. Forget a simple morning shower. Your daily life as a priest was a relentless, often unpleasant, pursuit of ritual cleanliness. Imagine yourself an Egyptian priest waking long before dawn. Your first duty isn't prayer, but an exhaustive series of purification rites. You'd first perform a full body ablution, bathing not once, but several times a day. This wasn't just a quick rinse, that you had to cleanse yourself in sacred pools or special basins, ensuring every part of your body was ritually pure before approaching the divine. Imagine the cold water against your skin in the chill of the morning, and the constant repetition of this act throughout the day, especially before and after every major ritual. Then there's the extreme attention to your body hair. For an Egyptian priest, all body hair was considered ritually impure. This meant you had to shave your entire body, your head, your face, your arms, your legs, even your eyebrows, usually every single day. Imagine the tedious, painstaking process of meticulously removing all hair with bronze razors. Cuts, nicks, and razor burn would be a constant nuisance. And the sheer discomfort of constantly growing stubble, which would immediately need to be shaved again, would be a perpetual irritation. A common historical fact is that priests often shaved their heads daily, making them instantly recognizable and symbolizing their complete dedication to purity. Beyond shaving, your finger and toenails had to be perfectly clean and trimmed, often filed down to the quick. This wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about ensuring no dirt or impurity could cling to you when you handled sacred objects or touched the god's statue. Imagine the meticulous attention to detail, the time spent on this seemingly minor task, knowing that any imperfection could render you ritually impure. Your clothing, too, was part of this relentless pursuit of purity. You couldn't wear wool, which was considered ritually unclean as it came from an animal. Instead, your garments were exclusively made of linen, a plant-based fiber. Imagine wearing only linen, perhaps a simple white kilt or a robe, day in and day out. While linen is breathable, it wrinkles easily and offers little warmth in the cooler seasons, and provides virtually no protection from the harsh desert sun. It also stains easily, meaning constant laundering was necessary to maintain the pristine white required for ritual purity. And then there's the dietary purity. Priests often had strict dietary prohibitions, avoiding certain foods believed to be impure, such as fish, beans, or even specific types of meat. Imagine a life where your food choices were severely limited, not by preference, but by strict religious decree, ensuring that nothing impure could enter your body. This wasn't about being healthy. It was about maintaining a state of ritual cleanliness, inside and out. The purpose of all this grueling self-discipline wasn't about personal comfort. It was about becoming a perfectly clean vessel for the divine. You, as a priest, were the intermediary between humanity and the gods. Any impurity on your part could offend the deities, bringing wrath or misfortune upon the entire land. Imagine the immense pressure, the constant anxiety of knowing that the cosmic order, the very flow of the Nile, depended on your personal adherence to these meticulous, physically demanding rites. This relentless focus on external purity also meant a certain detachment from the messy realities of ordinary human life. You were constantly striving for an ideal, a state of perfect cleanliness that separated you from the common folk. This could lead to a sense of isolation, a life lived constantly under the exacting gaze of both the gods and your fellow priests. Historians still debate the specific psychological impact of such extreme daily purification rituals on the individual priest, and whether it truly led to spiritual transcendence or simply to a life of rigid, almost obsessive behavior. So, as you picture the Egyptian priest in his pristine white linen, remember that beneath that calm exterior was a body constantly being shaved, washed, and meticulously cleaned, enduring minor cuts, constant irritation, and often cold discomfort, all in the tireless pursuit of ritual purity. It certainly makes you appreciate your own less demanding morning routine, doesn't it? For an Egyptian priest, holiness was truly a daily physical grind. You've just endured the relentless physical demands of ritual purity, a constant, irritating pursuit of cleanliness. Now, let's move from what was applied to the priest's body to what was put into it. Forget lavish banquets and varied culinary delights. The truth of a monotonous and restrictive diet reveals a life where food was less about enjoyment and more about adherence to strict taboos, often leading to a bland, repetitive, and surprisingly limited menu. Imagine yourself as an Egyptian priest, sitting down for a meal in the temple precinct. While other Egyptians might enjoy a wider array of foods, your diet is heavily constrained by religious prohibitions and the need to maintain ritual purity. This isn't about personal preference, it's about divine law and ancient tradition. First, let's talk about meat. While Egyptians generally ate meat, priests often faced significant restrictions. Pork, for instance, was widely considered ritually unclean and forbidden for priestly consumption. Even other meats, like beef or poultry, might be restricted depending on the specific deity served or the level of purity required. You might only be allowed to eat certain cuts or meat from animals sacrificed in a particular pure manner. Imagine a life where a juicy cut of roasted meat, a common pleasure for many, was often off limits, replaced by bland alternatives. Then there's the strict avoidance of fish. Fish, as creatures of the Nile's murky depths, were frequently associated with impurity and chaotic forces in Egyptian religion. For priests, consuming fish was typically forbidden. Imagine the frustration of living along the abundant Nile, surrounded by fishermen, yet being unable to partake in one of the most common and accessible protein sources. Your diet immediately becomes more challenging, as you're cutting out a major food group that sustained many ordinary Egyptians. A common historical fact is that Herodotus, the Greek historian, noted the Egyptians' aversion to fish, especially for priests, underscoring this significant dietary restriction. Beyond meat and fish, various vegetables and legumes were also considered taboo for priests. Onions and garlic, while staple foods for the common populace and even believed to have medicinal properties, were sometimes avoided due to their strong odors or association with funerary rites. Beans were also frequently forbidden. Imagine having to carefully scrutinize every meal, ensuring no forbidden ingredients slipped in, lest you become ritually impure and risk offending the gods. Your culinary world shrinks considerably, leaving you with a rather bland selection of permissible foods. Your mainstays would be bread and beer, lots of it. Emmer wheat and barley were the primary grains, baked into various forms of bread. Beer, brewed from barley, was the daily beverage, safer than contaminated water and providing essential calories. While nourishing, imagine the sheer monotony of this diet. Bread and beer, day in and day out, with little variation. Your taste buds would be perpetually bored, yearning for flavors that were simply off limits. This wasn't about gastronomic pleasure, it was about sustenance within strict ritual bounds. The preparation of your food also had to adhere to strict rules, ensuring it remained pure. It couldn't be touched by the impure or prepared with unclean utensils. This added another layer of complexity and constant vigilance to every meal. You couldn't just grab a snack. Every bite was a potential breach of purity. Historians still debate the extent of individual priests' adherence to all these dietary rules, and whether there were exceptions or varying levels of strictness based on rank or specific temple. However, the general framework of restrictions was undeniable. The overall result of these dietary prohibitions was a very monotonous and often bland menu. While Egyptian cuisine could be rich and varied for the elite, your priestly plate was often repetitive, filled with staples like unleavened bread, lentils, and perhaps some permitted poultry. Prepared simply, the pleasure of food, a simple human joy, was largely suppressed in favor of ritual adherence. This restrictive diet wasn't designed to make your life easy. It was another form of self-discipline, a constant reminder of your sacred role and your separation from the common. Less pure populace. By denying yourself common pleasures and adhering to strict rules, you demonstrated your devotion and maintained your ritual purity, a vessel worthy of serving the gods. However, the constant denial and the lack of variety would undoubtedly take a toll, making meals a duty rather than a delight. So, as you imagine the priest at his simple, restrictive meal, remember that holiness in ancient Egypt came with a significant culinary cost. The strict dietary rules, the endless repetition of bland staples, and the constant denial of common foods made daily sustenance a continuous act of discipline, removing much of the joy from eating. It certainly makes you appreciate your varied diet and the freedom to choose your own meals, doesn't it? For an Egyptian priest, every bite was a testament to his unwavering and often unappetizing devotion. You've just navigated the dietary restrictions of an ancient Egyptian priest, a life of blandness in the name of purity. But beyond what you put into your body, there was what you did with your body, day in and day out, within the temple walls. Forget occasional sermons or quiet meditation. The truth of endless, repetitive temple duties reveals a life of long hours, monotonous tasks, and highly ritualized actions that left little room for personal spontaneity or comfort. Imagine yourself, an Egyptian priest walking through the dimly lit corridors of a massive temple. The sun outside might be scorching, but within these thick stone walls, it's cool, almost damp. You've already completed your rigorous purification rites and consumed your unexciting breakfast. Now, the main work of the day begins, a series of meticulously choreographed rituals that repeat almost identically, day after day, year after year. Your primary duty revolves around the cult statue of the god. This statue, believed to be the living embodiment of the deity, required constant attention and elaborate care. Imagine entering the sanctuary, a sacred space usually forbidden to all but the highest-ranking priests. The air here is heavy with the scent of old incense and divine mystery. You approach the statue, often shrouded or in a naos, a small shrine. Your first task might be to unbolt its shrine, then to ritually cleanse the statue itself. Imagine carefully wiping down the ancient effigy with sacred oils, perhaps applying fresh cosmetics, and adorning it with new jewels and clean linen garments. This isn't a quick dusting, it's a precise, reverent act, performed with utmost care, knowing that any mistake could offend the god. After cleansing and adorning, you would present the god with its daily meal. This wasn't actual consumption by the statue, but a symbolic offering. Imagine laying out trays of meticulously prepared food, fresh bread, roasted fowl, fruits, and wine, before the god's image. You would then recite specific incantations, inviting the Ka life force of the deity to partake of the essence of the meal. Once the ritual was complete, the physical food would be removed and consumed by the priest, and perhaps distributed to other temple staff. Imagine preparing an elaborate meal for someone who won't truly eat it, only to then eat it yourself. A daily reminder of the god's abstract nature and your intermediary role. A common historical fact is that these offerings, after the god had symbolically eaten, became the property of the priests and temple staff, forming a significant part of their sustenance. Throughout the day, your duties would continue offering incense, reciting prayers, performing purifications in various parts of the temple. Each action was prescribed, each word precise. There was little room for improvisation or personal expression. You were a living cog in a vast ancient machine of divine service, ensuring the daily maintenance of the cosmic order Ma'at. Imagine the mental fatigue of this constant, unwavering adherence to ritual, the endless repetition of gestures and phrases that must be performed perfectly, without fail. You might also be involved in the maintenance of the temple complex itself, which was a massive undertaking. This wasn't about sweeping floors yourself, but overseeing various temple personnel, scribes, craftsmen, gardeners, and even agricultural workers who managed temple lands. You'd be involved in administering the vast temple economy, ensuring that its immense resources from grain to gold were properly managed to sustain its operations and its thousands of staff. This was a significant administrative burden, far from purely spiritual duties. Then there were the temple festivals and processions. These were grand public events, but for you, the priest, they meant even longer hours and more elaborate, demanding rituals. Imagine carrying the heavy sacred bark, a ceremonial boat of the god, in a public procession, enduring the heat and the crowds, knowing that your every step, every chant, must be flawless to maintain the god's favor and impress the populace. These events, while appearing joyous to the public, were physically grueling and mentally exhausting for the participating priests. Historians still debate the extent of direct priestly involvement in all daily temple functions versus relying on lower-ranking staff for routine tasks, but the high-level ritual duties were undeniably rigorous. The overall environment of the temple, while grand, could also be uncomfortable. We'll explore this more later, but imagine the dim lighting, the pervasive smell of incense, and the cool, damp air within the stone structures. You spent countless hours in these spaces, performing your duties, often in relative silence broken only by ritual chants. This endless cycle of repetitive, ritualized tasks, performed with unwavering precision, could lead to a profound sense of monotony and spiritual exhaustion. While the ultimate goal was to serve the gods and maintain Mayat, the daily grind might have felt more like a bureaucratic job than a transcendent spiritual calling. Your life was dictated by the ancient rhythm of the temple, leaving little space for individual desire or respite. So, as you hear the faint echoes of ancient chants, remember that being an Egyptian priest meant a life of arduous, often monotonous service to the gods. The long hours, the repetitive rituals, and the immense pressure to maintain divine favor through perfect adherence made daily temple duties a relentless physical and mental burden. It certainly makes you appreciate a varied job description and the freedom to mix up your routine, doesn't it? For an Egyptian priest, divine service was a tireless, repetitive dance. You've just been immersed in the relentless, repetitive duties of an Egyptian priest, a life dictated by rigid ritual. But beyond the physical grind and dietary restrictions, there was a far greater, more terrifying burden: the weight of divine responsibility. Forget casual worship. For an ancient Egyptian priest, maintaining cosmic order, known as Mayat, was a monumental task, demanding flawless execution of rituals and living with the constant, crushing pressure of potentially incurring divine wrath upon the entire land. Imagine yourself, an Egyptian priest, standing in the inner sanctuary, preparing for a critical ritual. You are not just performing actions, you are performing Mayat. Mayat was the fundamental concept of cosmic order, justice, balance, and harmony. It encompassed everything from the predictable flooding of the Nile to the rising of the sun, the health of the pharaoh, and the prosperity of the land. Your daily rituals, no matter how small, were believed to be essential to maintain this delicate balance, to literally keep the world from falling into chaos. Imagine the immense, suffocating pressure of knowing that the very well-being of your entire civilization rests, in part, on your shoulders. Every gesture, every chanted word, every offering had to be absolutely perfect. There was no room for error, no improvisation. You had to memorize complex litanies, precise movements, and intricate offerings, all passed down through generations of priestly tradition. Imagine the hours spent studying sacred texts, practicing rituals, ensuring that your memory was flawless, and because any slip, any mispronounced word, any incorrect offering could be interpreted as an insult to the gods. And an insulted god could withhold the Nile's flood, send famine, or unleash disease upon the land. The consequences of your personal mistake were not just personal, they were national, even cosmic. A common historical fact is that priests used ritual texts and handbooks to ensure absolute accuracy in their ceremonies. Underscoring the importance of precise execution, this led to a pervasive sense of anxiety and vigilance. You were constantly on guard, not just against human error, but against any subtle sign of divine displeasure. A sudden drought, an unexpected plague, a military defeat, any misfortune could be interpreted as a sign that Ma'at was out of balance, and that perhaps your rituals had been insufficient or even flawed. Imagine living under that cloud of potential blame, constantly questioning if you had done enough, if you were pure enough, if the gods were truly satisfied. The gods themselves were powerful, often capricious entities. While benevolent when pleased, they could also be terrifying in their wrath. Imagine performing a ritual for Sekhmet, the fierce lioness goddess, knowing that if you displeased her, she could unleash plague and destruction, or appealing to Seth, the god of chaos, hoping to appease his destructive nature. Your role was not just to worship, it was to manage and often placate these immense, unpredictable cosmic forces. The sheer weight of that responsibility, the knowledge that you were dealing with powers that could crush humanity, would be terrifying. Historians still debate the extent to which priests genuinely believed in the literal effectiveness of every single ritual versus viewing them as symbolic acts of piety. However, the societal belief in their efficacy was undeniable. Beyond your daily duties, priests were also often involved in interpreting omens and dreams. If the pharaoh or a high official had a disturbing dream, or if unusual phenomena occurred, you would be called upon to decipher their divine meaning. Imagine the pressure of interpreting these cryptic messages, knowing that your interpretation could influence major decisions of state, or even predict a catastrophe. Your wisdom was relied upon to guide the living in the face of the unknown, a heavy burden for any individual. The sheer scale of the temples themselves, and the vast resources they commanded, also added to this burden. You were responsible for managing enormous estates, countless personnel, and immense wealth, all dedicated to the service of the gods. This administrative responsibility, ensuring that the earthly machinery of divine worship ran smoothly, was a constant source of pressure, far removed from purely spiritual contemplation. Ultimately, being a priest in ancient Egypt was less about personal enlightenment and more about relentless, flawless service to a cosmic order that was both magnificent and terrifyingly delicate. Every breath you took, every ritual you performed, was a direct contribution to the well-being of your world. The weight of that divine responsibility, the constant fear of failure, and the knowledge of the catastrophic consequences of such failure made the life of an Egyptian priest a perpetual, high-stakes performance. It certainly makes you appreciate a job where your mistakes don't threaten the entire universe, doesn't it? For these priests, the gods were not just figures to worship, they were immense, watchful forces demanding perfection. You've just been burdened by the immense weight of divine responsibility, feeling the crushing pressure of maintaining Mejat through flawless ritual. But a priest's life wasn't just about cosmic duties, it was also deeply intertwined with the very human, often treacherous, world of power. Now, prepare to navigate the treacherous currents of political intrigue and royal scrutiny, where a priest's esteemed position came with constant dangers from shifting pharaonic favor and ruthless power struggles within the priesthood itself. Imagine yourself, an Egyptian priest holding a seemingly secure position within a powerful temple, perhaps even a high priest of a major cult like Amun-Re at Karnak. You are wealthy, influential, and respected, yet this very power makes you a target. Your life is inextricably linked to the whims of the pharaoh and the ruthless ambition of your peers. The most immediate danger came from the pharaoh's shifting favor. The pharaoh was considered a living god, and his word was law. His support could elevate you to immense power, but his displeasure could strip you of everything, including your life. Imagine a new pharaoh ascending the throne, or an existing one suddenly deciding to favor a different deity, or a rival temple. You might find your temple's endowments cut, your own authority undermined, or your career abruptly ended. Recall the radical religious reforms of Akhenaten, who suddenly promoted the Aten cult above all others. Imagine being a priest of Amun during his reign. Your entire world would have been turned upside down. Your livelihood and status threatened by royal decree. Historians still debate the true extent to which Akhenaten's reforms were a genuine religious conversion versus a political move to curb the power of the Amun priesthood. Regardless, the impact on individual priests was profound. Beyond the pharaoh, you faced constant threats from rivalries within the priesthood itself. The Egyptian priesthood was a vast, hierarchical organization, and ambition was rampant. Other priests eager for promotion, wealth, or influence would constantly jockey for position. Imagine the whispered conspiracies, the subtle slights, the outright accusations that could be leveled against you. A rival might accuse you of ritual impurity, financial mismanagement, or even treason, hoping to undermine your standing and seize your office. You'd have to be constantly vigilant, carefully choosing your allies and being wary of those who seemed overly friendly. The immense wealth of the temples also made them targets, not just for robbers, but for royal intervention. Temples owned vast tracts of land, held immense stores of grain, controlled significant workshops, and employed thousands of people. This economic power could rival that of the pharaoh himself, leading to inevitable tension. Imagine the pharaoh, needing funds for a war or a building project, suddenly suggesting that your temple contribute more resources. While outwardly a request, it would be an order you dared not refuse, knowing that defiance could lead to confiscation, demotion, or even worse. Your wealth was a source of power, but also a dangerous magnet for royal scrutiny. You also held vast amounts of sensitive information. Priests were often highly literate, managing temple archives, recording events, and sometimes even advising the pharaoh on omens or divine will. This knowledge, while powerful, also made you a target. Imagine knowing a secret that could jeopardize the pharaoh, or having access to records that could incriminate a powerful noble. You'd have to be incredibly discreet, knowing that a careless word could cost you your life. You're a keeper of secrets, but that position carries immense risk. And then there was the threat of public unrest. If the Nile failed to flood, or if famine struck, the populace might blame the gods, and by extension, their priests. While usually revered, priests could become targets of popular anger if Mayhat seemed to falter. Imagine facing an angry mob, demanding answers for the gods' apparent displeasure, fearing that their desperation could turn violent against you. Your perceived connection to divine power was a source of authority, but also a dangerous vulnerability during times of crisis. Archaeological evidence from periods of instability, like the late Bronze Age collapse, suggests that some temples suffered damage from internal unrest or invasion, hinting at the vulnerability of the priesthood. Ultimately, being a priest in ancient Egypt meant walking a tightrope between immense privilege and constant peril. Your influence was vast, but it rested on the fickle winds of royal favor and the treacherous machinations of a deeply ambitious court. You were a servant of the gods, but also a player in a high-stakes political game where the loss could mean not just your position, but your very life. It certainly makes you appreciate the separation of church and state and the relative stability of modern political systems, doesn't it? For an Egyptian priest, the sacred life was also deeply, terrifyingly political. You've just navigated the perilous waters of political intrigue and royal scrutiny, a constant tightrope walk for an Egyptian priest. But beyond the external threats, your sacred role brought a different kind of burden, isolation, and limited social life. Forget the bustling social circles of ordinary citizens. Your life as a priest often meant a profound separation from everyday society and severe constraints on your personal relationships, fostering a unique form of loneliness. Imagine yourself, an Egyptian priest, walking through the temple gates. While the temple was a vibrant hub of activity, drawing pilgrims and citizens for festivals, your daily life was largely confined within its sacred boundaries, or to your priestly quarters. You were set apart, ritually pure, and dedicated to the gods, which inevitably created a barrier between you and the common populace. Your life was not one of casual mingling in the marketplace or relaxed evenings with friends at a tavern. One of the most significant aspects of this isolation was the separation from your family and wider community. While priests might have families, their duties and the purity requirements often meant they lived a life distinct from their lay relatives. Imagine being a son or a daughter of a priest. Your father might be revered, but his time and attention were primarily dedicated to the temple. Conversely, for the priest, the demands of the gods often superseded family obligations. This could lead to emotional distance, a feeling of being constantly on duty, even when not actively performing rituals. Historians still debate the extent to which priestly families were integrated into wider society versus forming a distinct, somewhat insular, social class. However, their ritual obligations undeniably set them apart. Your social interactions were largely limited to other priests. Imagine spending most of your days with colleagues who shared your strictures, your duties, and your unique worldview. While camaraderie might exist, it was also tinged with the political rivalries we discussed, making true, unburdened friendship rare. You were constantly performing your role, even among your peers, aware of the hierarchy and the competition for favor. There was little opportunity for casual, unscripted social engagement with those outside your priestly circle. Even during temple festivals and when the public thronged the outer courts, you, as a priest, would be engaged in the inner sanctums, performing rituals unseen by the masses. While the public experienced the joy and spectacle, you were behind the scenes, ensuring the ritual precision. Imagine hearing the distant cheers of the crowd, knowing you are the reason for their celebration, yet remaining hidden, a spiritual engine rather than a participant in the public revelry. Your connection to the divine was intimate, but your connection to ordinary human joy and communal life was profoundly restricted. Your education and knowledge also contributed to this isolation. Priests were among the most educated members of society, privy to ancient texts, complex theological concepts, and secret rites. This intellectual superiority, while respected, also created a divide. Imagine trying to explain the intricacies of cosmic order or the nuances of ritual purity to a farmer or craftsman. The intellectual gap might have been too vast for meaningful social connection beyond your prescribed role. The strict purity requirements further limited your social life. As we discussed, you had to avoid certain foods, situations, and even people who might be considered ritually impure. This meant you couldn't simply attend any social gathering or share a meal with just anyone. Your purity was a fragile state, easily compromised, requiring constant vigilance and careful avoidance of potential sources of contamination. Imagine having to politely decline invitations or always keeping a careful distance, not for fear of losing your ritual purity. This self-imposed segregation, while necessary for your duties, undoubtedly fostered a sense of detachment. For female priests, though less common in later periods, they existed, especially as gods' wives or priestesses of specific goddesses. The isolation could be even more profound. combining ritual purity with the societal expectations of female seclusion. Ultimately, being a priest in ancient Egypt meant choosing a path that led to a profound spiritual connection, but often at the cost of genuine human connection. Your life was structured, disciplined, and deeply meaningful in its purpose. Yet it could also be surprisingly lonely, separating you from the mundane joys and easy companionship that ordinary people took for granted. The weight of your sacred office and the meticulous demands of purity often left you in a gilded cage of spiritual solitude. It certainly makes you appreciate casual friendships and spontaneous outings, and doesn't it? For an Egyptian priest, divine service often came with a heavy dose of human loneliness. You've just been introduced to the unique brand of loneliness that came with the sacred, yet socially isolated, life of an Egyptian priest. But beyond the personal discomfort, there was the less glamorous, often quite unpleasant, reality of their workplace. Forget the gleaming, sun-drenched halls you see in documentaries. The truth of primitive temple conditions reveals a daily immersion in environments that were often dark, smoky, and surprisingly uncomfortable. A far cry from the serene sanctuaries we might imagine. Imagine yourself, an Egyptian priest, spending countless hours inside a massive temple. These weren't brightly lit, airy spaces filled with natural light. Many areas, particularly the deeper sanctuaries and inner halls, were intentionally kept in perpetual gloom. Light came primarily from narrow slits high on the walls, or from flickering oil lamps and torches. Imagine navigating vast halls and dark chambers, your only illumination the unreliable glow of a lamp, casting long, dancing shadows that could make even familiar statues seem menacing. This wasn't just atmospheric, it was practical, helping to preserve papyrus scrolls and painted reliefs from direct sunlight, but it created a constantly dim, somber environment that would strain your eyes and contribute to a feeling of confinement. Then there was the smoke. Incense was burned constantly in Egyptian temples as part of purification rituals and offerings to the gods. Imagine the air, thick and heavy with the pervasive scent and particulate matter of burning frankincense, myrrh, and other resins. While perhaps pleasant at first, constant exposure to dense smoke would irritate your lungs, your eyes, and your throat. You might suffer from chronic coughs, watery eyes, and a general feeling of respiratory congestion. Your clothes, your skin, your hair, everything would be permeated with the clinging smell of incense smoke, a constant reminder of your smoky workplace. A common historical fact is that archaeological evidence from temple ceilings often shows dark soot stains from millennia of incense burning. The temperature and humidity inside these massive stone structures could also be uncomfortable. While thick stone walls offered some respite from the scorching desert sun, they also retained a pervasive dampness, especially if the temple was close to the Nile or its annual floods. Imagine the cool, clammy air in the deeper parts of the temple, a constant chill that seeped into your bones. In other areas, particularly during summer, the stone could absorb and radiate heat, turning certain halls into stifling ovens. There was no climate control, no fans beyond the occasional handheld feather fan. You were entirely at the mercy of the natural elements, amplified by the unyielding stone. And the floors forget polished marble pathways throughout? Many temple floors were roughly paved or even just packed earth, especially in less sacred or utility areas. Imagine walking barefoot, as was often required for purity, across cold, hard, uneven stone or dusty ground for hours on end, day after day. Your feet would ache, develop calluses, and be prone to scrapes and infections from the constant contact with the dirty surfaces. Sanitation, while perhaps better than a common household, was still rudimentary by modern standards. Waste from ritual offerings, or even personal waste from long shifts, would need to be managed, contributing to less than fresh odors in certain areas. Vermin, such as rats and insects, would inevitably be present in a large, ancient building with food offerings. While diligent, priests couldn't entirely eradicate them. The sheer scale of the temple itself could also be a source of discomfort and exhaustion. You were responsible for vast areas, walking long distances within the complex to perform various duties. Imagine the physical toll of constantly moving through monumental courtyards, up and down stairs, and through endless halls, all while maintaining ritual decorum. Your job required significant physical stamina, far beyond what might be expected from a modern religious leader. Even the impressive architecture, with its towering columns and massive statues, could contribute to a sense of being dwarfed, of being a tiny, insignificant cog in a colossal ancient machine. The overwhelming scale, combined with the dim lighting and the oppressive silence broken only by ritual sounds, could foster a sense of being constantly under the gaze of immense, unseen powers. Archaeologists and architects still study the precise ways in which Egyptian temple design was intended to evoke awe and create a specific sensory experience for priests and worshippers alike. So, as you hear the distant echoes of ritual chants, remember that the ancient Egyptian temple, for all its grandeur and spiritual significance, was often a physically challenging and uncomfortable workplace for its priests. The constant gloom, the pervasive smoke, the extreme temperatures, and the sheer physical demands made daily life within its sacred walls a far cry from a luxurious or effortless existence. It certainly makes you appreciate clean air, consistent lighting, and climate control in your own environments, doesn't it? For an Egyptian priest, holiness often came with a heavy, smoky, and tiring reality. You've just navigated the dim, smoky, and often uncomfortable realities of ancient Egyptian temples, the very workplace of the priests. But for a specific segment of the priesthood, those involved with funerary cults and embalming, there was a far more constant and unsettling reality dealing with death and decay. Forget abstract spiritual concepts. These priests faced daily exposure to mummies, rotting flesh, and the morbid, often gruesome, aspects of their duties. A constant immersion in the processes of mortality. Imagine yourself as a priest, specifically one of the Wab priests known for their purity or those involved directly with the mortuary cults. Especially during the preparation of a mummy, the air you breathe is thick with the sweet, cloying smell of natron, resins, and spices. But underneath it, the unmistakable, sickening odor of decaying flesh. This isn't a brief exposure, this is your daily reality. Working for weeks on a single body, your duty begins soon after death. The body, though treated quickly, is still undergoing the initial stages of decomposition. Imagine the sight: a human corpse, soon to be transformed, but currently a grim, lifeless vessel. You might be involved in the first, most gruesome stages of embalming, such as the removal of the brain. Imagine the embalmer, a specialized priest or craftsman, inserting a long, hooked instrument through the nostril, then painstakingly liquefying and extracting the brain. The sight, the smell, the knowledge of what is happening to the deceased's most vital organ would be chilling. A common historical fact is that the brain was generally discarded as it was not believed to be important for the afterlife. Unlike the heart, then comes the evisceration. The internal organs, the lungs, liver, intestines, and stomach, had to be removed through an incision in the side. Imagine watching, or even assisting in, this process. The smell of the internal organs, especially after the initial stages of decay, would be overwhelming and nauseating. You would see the raw, exposed viscera, carefully removed, cleansed, and then placed in separate canopic jars, each dedicated to a specific protective deity. This was a messy, unpleasant, and undeniably gruesome task, a constant reminder of the physical realities of death. For 70 days, you would be involved in the desiccation process, where the body was covered in natron salt to draw out all moisture. Imagine the appearance of the body during this stage: shriveling, darkening, transforming into a dried husk. The dust from the natron, the lingering smell of the drying flesh, these would be constant companions. Your hands would touch the changing form of the deceased, witnessing firsthand the slow transformation from living being to preserved mummy. Historians still debate the exact composition and application methods of natron salt, as well as the full sequence of the mummification process. As ancient texts are sometimes vague, beyond the embalming process itself, priests and funerary cults were responsible for the daily care of mummies and tombs for centuries after the burial. Imagine entering a tomb deep within the necropolis, not for treasure, but to perform rituals for the deceased. The air here would be dry, dusty, and carry the faint, musty smell of ancient linen, dried resins, and millennia of undisturbed death. You would regularly interact with the mummified remains, presenting offerings, reciting prayers, and ensuring the integrity of the burial chamber. This meant a constant, intimate proximity to the dead, a life lived in the shadow of mortality. The psychological toll of this constant exposure to death and decay would be profound. You would become desensitized to the sight of corpses, but the underlying knowledge of human mortality, the grim realities of the physical body's end, would always be present. Your dreams might be filled with the images of the mummified dead or the smells of the embalming workshop. It was a life steeped in the morbid, a daily confrontation with the very thing most humans try to avoid. Moreover, priests had to handle the various funerary offerings, some of which were organic and would eventually decay, attracting insects or emitting unpleasant odors even within sealed tombs. While they aimed for perfect preservation, the natural world often found a way to reclaim its own. So, as you hear the distant echoes of ritual chants, remember that for a significant portion of ancient Egyptian priests, their sacred duty involved a daily, intimate, and often gruesome confrontation with death and decay. The smells, the sights, and the physical handling of human remains made their holy work a far cry from ethereal contemplation, imbuing their lives with a pervasive morbid reality. It certainly makes you appreciate modern embalming practices and the relative distance we keep from the deceased, doesn't it? For these priests, the path to the afterlife was literally paved with the physical realities of the dead. You've just been immersed in the grim, tactile realities of death and decay, a constant companion for many Egyptian priests. But beyond the physical and environmental discomforts, there was another, more cerebral yet equally heavy burden, the burden of secret knowledge. Forget simple prayer books. These priests were the custodians of sacred texts, complex theological concepts, and the interpreters of often terrifying omens, forcing them to live with immense intellectual pressure and the responsibility of deciphering the unpredictable will of the gods. Imagine yourself, an Egyptian priest, specifically a lector priest, Heb, or a priest involved in the House of Life, the temple's scriptorium and library. Your primary duty is to study, copy, and guard vast collections of ancient papyri. These aren't just historical records, they are divine texts, filled with spells, rituals, astronomical observations, medical knowledge, and theological doctrines. Imagine spending countless hours in dimly lit rooms, carefully unrolling fragile scrolls, meticulously copying hieroglyphs with reed pens onto fresh papyrus. The air is dry, dusty, and smells faintly of old papyrus and ink. Your eyes ache from the strain, and your hand cramps from the intricate work. This is a tireless, painstaking process, requiring immense literacy and an unwavering dedication to accuracy. The knowledge you possessed was often secret and esoteric. Many texts were not meant for the common populace. They were sacred, hidden wisdom, revealed only to the initiated. Imagine living with the weight of this secret knowledge, knowing profound truths about the universe, the gods, and the afterlife that the ordinary person could never grasp. This intellectual isolation, while a source of power, also set you apart, creating a mental barrier between you and the uninitiated world. You are a gatekeeper of divine mysteries, a heavy responsibility that few could share. Then there was the terrifying duty of interpreting omens and dreams. The ancient Egyptians believed the gods communicated through signs in the natural world and through dreams. If the pharaoh or high-ranking official had a disturbing dream, if a strange celestial event occurred, or if an unusual phenomenon was observed in nature, you, the priest, would be called upon to decipher its meaning. Imagine the immense pressure of interpreting these cryptic messages. Was the dream a warning of famine? Did the comet portend a foreign invasion? Your interpretation could influence major state decisions, incite fear, or demand costly rituals to appease offended deities. A single misinterpretation could lead to disaster, and perhaps blame falling squarely on your shoulders. Historians still debate the extent to which these interpretations were genuine attempts at divination versus pragmatic tools for political influence or social control. Regardless, the priests bore the weight of these weighty decisions. You also held the knowledge of complex magical spells and protective incantations. While not necessarily practicing black magic in the modern sense, priests were adept at using ritual and words to influence outcomes, ward off evil, and ensure the well-being of the deceased in the afterlife. Imagine memorizing thousands of intricate spells, their precise wording and accompanying gestures, knowing that any deviation could render them ineffective or worse, backfire. This knowledge was powerful, but also dangerous, demanding absolute mastery and constant vigilance against error. The responsibility of guarding the sacred texts was paramount. These texts were not just books. They were repositories of divine wisdom and magical power. Imagine the immense pressure to protect them from damage, from theft, or from falling into the wrong hands. They were kept in special temple libraries, carefully stored and meticulously cataloged, but always vulnerable to the ravages of time, fire, or human malice. Your life might literally depend on keeping these secrets safe. The content of some of these texts could also be unsettling. Beyond benevolent deities, Egyptian mythology was filled with terrifying demons, chaotic forces, and the grim realities of the underworld. Imagine reading descriptions of the tortures awaiting the damned, or the monstrous entities guarding the gates of the afterlife. This constant immersion in the darker aspects of their theology, while perhaps desensitizing, would also instill a certain level of existential dread. Ultimately, being an Egyptian priest meant living with a profound, intellectual burden. You were a scholar, a theologian, a diviner, and a magical practitioner, all rolled into one. The constant study, the meticulous memorization, the weighty responsibility of interpreting divine will, and the terrifying consequences of error made your life a continuous mental ordeal. Your power came from your knowledge, but that knowledge was a heavy, and often terrifying, burden to bear. It certainly makes you appreciate Google, where knowledge is freely accessible and mistakes are easily corrected. Doesn't it? For these priests, wisdom came at a high price of perpetual mental strain and profound responsibility. You've just shouldered the immense intellectual burden of secret knowledge, a constant mental strain for an Egyptian priest. But now, let's consider a final, often overlooked reality of their existence, the cycle of service and secular life. Forget the image of a priest dedicated full-time, living solely within temple walls. For many, the priesthood was a part-time rotating duty, requiring them to constantly shift between the sacred and the mundane, creating a unique set of challenges and discomforts. Imagine yourself as an Egyptian man, living an ordinary life. You might be a farmer, a craftsman, a scribe, or a merchant, but for a specific period of the year, usually a month at a time, you are called to serve as a priest. This was the system of files or watches. The priesthood was often divided into groups files, and each file would serve for a rotational period, perhaps 1 month out of every 4. Imagine suddenly being plucked from your normal life, your family, your business, and thrust into the rigorous, highly disciplined world of the temple. The first challenge is the abrupt transition itself. One day you're haggling in the marketplace, smelling the dust and the produce. The next, you're undergoing intense purification rituals, shaving your entire body, and preparing to enter the hallowed, dimly lit halls of the temple. Imagine the mental and physical adjustment required. You have to immediately adopt a completely different set of behaviors, a rigid protocol of purity, diet, and ritual precision. Your mind has to switch from mundane concerns to cosmic responsibility overnight. This constant back and forth between the sacred and the secular could be disorienting and exhausting. A common historical fact is that this part-time system allowed many men to participate in the priesthood without abandoning their primary livelihoods, making it accessible to a wider segment of society than a full-time monastic commitment. Then there's the maintenance of purity outside of service. Even when you return to your ordinary life, the priest's purity requirements weren't entirely shed. You might still observe certain dietary restrictions or maintain a higher standard of personal cleanliness than your lay neighbors, lest you become too impure for your next rotation of temple duty. Imagine trying to integrate back into your family and community life while still holding yourself to these strict, often inconvenient standards. This created a subtle, lingering separation, even when you were supposedly off duty. The economic implications were also complex. While priests received a share of the temple's offerings, often the physical food that had been presented to the gods, this might not have been enough to fully support a family for the entire year. Many priests maintained their secular professions during their off-duty periods. Imagine balancing your sacred duties with the need to run a farm or a workshop, ensuring your family's livelihood. Your spiritual calling was important, but so was putting food on the table, creating a constant tension between two very different demands on your time and energy. Furthermore, the knowledge you gained in the temple, while prestigious, couldn't always be openly shared or easily integrated into your secular life. You might have access to secret texts or specific ritual knowledge that was forbidden to the uninitiated. Imagine having profound insights or a deeper understanding of the world, but being unable to discuss it openly with your family or friends, maintaining a discreet silence that further separated you. This intellectual burden, as we discussed, didn't just disappear when your rotation ended. The physical demands also continued. Even when away from the temple, you had to maintain a certain level of fitness and discipline to be ready for your next rigorous month of service. There was no true off-season for an Egyptian priest. The call to sacred duty could come at any time, requiring immediate readiness. Historians still debate the extent of discomfort or double life tension experienced by these part-time priests, with some suggesting they seamlessly integrated roles, while others emphasize the distinct nature of their two worlds. Ultimately, the cycle of service and secular life for many Egyptian priests meant a constant oscillation between two very different realities. One moment, you were a humble citizen; the next, a conduit to the divine, burdened by immense ritual and cosmic responsibility. This perpetual shift, the need to maintain purity and knowledge while also engaging in the messy realities of daily life, created a unique form of discomfort and a fascinating insight into the practicalities of ancient Egyptian religion. It certainly makes you appreciate a clear distinction between your work life and your personal life, doesn't it? For these priests, the sacred and the mundane were never truly far apart. You have completed your journey into the lesser-known aspects of the life of the ancient Egyptian priesthood. We have been through the arduous purification rituals, the monotonous diet, the endless repetition of temple duties, the crushing burden of divine responsibility, the dangerous political intrigue, the isolation and limited social life, the primitive living conditions in the temple, the constant exposure to death and decay, the burden of secret knowledge, and finally the cycle of service and secular life. As you drift off to sleep, let the image of the unceasing dedication, the intricate rituals, and the burden of a sacred yet challenging life fade away. It is a reminder that even the most exalted positions come with their own burdens and inconveniences.